What is the Gender Equality Index? AGE's Gender Equality Index measures the progress of gender equality in the European Union. It shows gender equality trends in the domains of work, money, knowledge, time, power, health, and violence. Each year, the Gender Equality Index scores the EU and the member states from 1 to 100. A score of 100 would mean that a country has reached full equality between women and men. The index also looks at intersecting inequalities, which considers the situation of different groups of women and men based on family type, level of education, country of birth, age, and disability. Each year, the index has a thematic focus. This time, we are taking an in-depth look at health and gender equality.
As Europe looks for ways to recover from the economic, social, and public health consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic that have affected the lives of women and men all across the European Union, we hope that our index findings will inspire Europe's leaders to design solutions that are inclusive and promote gender equality in our societies. The moment to reveal this year's scores for the Gender Equality Index is here. The European Union's score for gender equality is 68 points out of 100. This is a tiny increase of 0.6 points from last year's edition, and a mere 4.9 points since 2010. There are big variations in gender equality scores between countries, from 83.9 points in Sweden to 52.5 points in Greece. Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands are Europe's top performers this year. Sweden and Denmark have held on to their top position since last year, while the Netherlands has jumped 2 spots to gain 3rd place. This caused France and Finland to each drop 1 spot in the rankings, to 4th and 5th place respectively. Since last year's edition, Luxembourg, Lithuania, and the Netherlands have improved the most, with a gain of around 2 points. These changes have been mostly driven by improvements in decision-making, especially due to better gender balance on company boards. Slovenia was the only country that went backwards in its overall index score since last year, losing points in the area of decision-making. 10 member states scored lower than 60 points in this year's Gender Equality Index, with Greece, Hungary, and Romania struggling the most. These 3 countries face major challenges with gender equality in decision-making, as well as in the domain of work and time. When we look at progress trends between 2010 and 2019, we see that index scores have increased by more than 8.5 points for Luxembourg, Malta, Italy, Austria, and Portugal. In Estonia, France, Cyprus, Ireland, Spain, Croatia, Latvia, and Germany, index score increases ranged between 6 and 8.2 points. Generally, countries with lower levels of gender equality have been progressing faster, while the growth in top-performing countries has been much slower. Let's take a closer look to see where the EU is performing best in gender equality and where improvements are needed. The EU is farthest away from gender equality in the domain of power, which focuses on decision-making, and it is the lowest scoring domain in the index. However, this is also the domain which has improved the most since 2010. These changes have largely been driven by improvements in economic and political decision-making. This is because more women are taking up decision-making positions on company boards and in politics, a trend we have observed in recent editions of the index. In 2021, 30% of board members of the largest publicly listed companies in member states are women. Outstanding developments in 7 member states, following the introduction of quotas, has fueled most of the progress. At the current rate of change, countries with binding quotas will take around 4 years to achieve boardroom gender parity. But for countries that take no action, it will take more than 125 years to reach gender parity in boardrooms. In large companies, women account for less than 1 in 10 board presidents or CEOs. There's still a long way to go.
The results from this year's Gender Equality Index show fragile gains in gender equality. However, the big losses that Europe has suffered as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic put even these gains at risk. As part of this year's index report, we have looked at the fallout from the pandemic, and this is what we found. The economic fallout from the COVID-19 crisis will last longer for women. After years of growth across the EU, employment has declined for both women and men since the start of the pandemic. Jobs losses were highly concentrated in sectors where women make up the majority of the workforce, such as retail, accommodation, residential care, domestic work, and clothing manufacturing. Most of these sectors did not recover throughout 2020. Although employment rates started to rise last summer, men were twice as likely than women to get back to jobs, showing that the negative economic impact of the COVID crisis will affect women longer than it will affect men. The COVID-19 pandemic made women more vulnerable to income loss. The risk of poverty or social exclusion was already higher for women than for men in the EU before the pandemic, and the COVID-19 crisis is likely to make the situation even worse. While all member states adopted measures to help those who lost jobs or weren't earning during the pandemic or weren't earning very much, these kinds of measures were less likely to reach women. That's because women are more likely to work in sectors that offer lower benefits and are less likely to meet the eligibility criteria for government support. School closures reinforce inequality in education and unpaid work. As schools and universities rapidly shifted to digital learning, girls and boys from lower socio-economic backgrounds often lacked internet access and a quieter room to study. The transition to remote learning was challenging for all, teachers, students, and parents alike. Children in primary schools needed a high degree of parental involvement in online schooling, creating extra unpaid work as well as work-life balance conflicts for parents, especially mothers. During the pandemic, unpaid care increased, especially for lone mothers. While time spent on care duties increased for all parents during the pandemic, the impact has been huge on mothers of children under 12 and lone mothers, expanding existing gender inequalities in the responsibilities of unpaid care. On the flip side, the beginning of the pandemic led to a modest increase in time spent by men on unpaid care, especially fathers who lost their jobs or whose partner was an essential worker. The pandemic reminded us that we need more women in important decision-making positions. Although women make up around 70% of health professionals, this majority does not carry over into leadership positions in the healthcare sector. During the pandemic and until March 2021, only 1 in 4 ministers of health in the EU were women. Women were also largely left out of the COVID-19 task forces that were set up in all countries to tackle the pandemic. When this happened, there was a risk that women's needs were left out of the solutions designed to address the pandemic. Due to COVID-19, life expectancy dropped, especially for men. This drop is related to higher fatalities to the virus and higher excess mortality for men in most EU countries. Birth rates also dropped. Psychological distress, economic uncertainty, and an increase in unpaid care work for women led couples to delay having children or to decide not to have them at all. The effects of the pandemic also took a heavy toll on mental health. Lockdowns led to loneliness. More care and household work caused parents, especially lone mothers, to burn out. Restrictions on mobility and increased isolation exposed women to a higher risk of intimate partner violence during the lockdowns. For victims of violence, their legal and social support networks were shattered or, in some cases, never existed, making it very difficult or impossible to seek immediate support or to escape from home. For older women, the lockdowns exacerbated the factors which put them at risk of violence: social isolation and loneliness, mental health problems such as depression and anxiety, and financial dependency.
So, what needs to be done to ensure that we build back better and keep advancing gains in gender equality? It's clear that pre-existing gender inequalities, such as in the labor market and in the provision of care, have shaped the pandemic's impact on people's health and well-being, as well as their livelihoods. If we want to recover from this pandemic, gender equality must be at the core of recovery measures. This is crucial to strengthen the resilience of our society and improve the life of every woman and man in the European Union. Here is what we need: recovery strategies that are designed to equally benefit women and men. National gender equality bodies should work with the national structures responsible for COVID-19 recovery efforts to ensure that gender mainstreaming tools are used throughout the recovery. Gender impact assessments would help policymakers estimate how recovery strategies will affect women and men differently. And gender budgeting would help ensure women and men benefit equally from government spending. The COVID crisis has not been gender neutral. Recovery efforts can't be either. If gender inequalities are not taken into account, we are at risk of losing the fragile gains we have made in gender equality over recent years. We need to invest more in the health and care sector. From nurses in intensive care units to those providing professional care in people's homes, it was predominantly women on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. These jobs deserve respect, and not through clapping, but through better pay and working conditions. Improving the condition and status of care work could also attract more men to these jobs, which are critical for the future of Europe. Last but not least, we need governments to tackle gender-based violence in crisis times as part of their long-term gender equality strategies. Member states need to be ready before disaster strikes. They need to pass new legislation, introduce digital ways of helping victims, and fund organizations that support women facing violence. The police, justice, social, and health sectors need to be coordinated so that victims get the essential assistance they need in time. Next year's index will reveal the longer socio-economic consequences of the pandemic on gender equality.
You can find all our index-related materials on EGE's website. Compare the results for each country, view the report, and explore the data. Follow #EGEIndex on social media for more updates.